It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest, Professor Baldwin. Professor Baldwin is a senior political scientist at the Princeton School of Public Health and International Affairs at Princeton University and Wallach Professor of Political Science Emeritus at Columbia University, where he also served as the director of the Institute of War and Peace Studies. His book, Economic Statecraft, received the Gladys M. Kammerer Award for Best Political Science Publication from the American Political Science Association. Now it's my honor to welcome our guest, Professor Baldwin, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Pleased to be here. Let me start out just by talking about a little bit about the history of the use of economic foreign policy instruments. They've been used for thousands of years. Even ancient Athens used them. But we didn't start talking about them as economic sanctions until, it wasn't commonplace until the League of Nations in the early part of the 20th century had built into it a provision for mandatory economic sanctions in the case of to combat aggression. And the League did not make much use of this until in 1936, when Italy invaded Ethiopia, then called Abyssinia, and the League put some economic sanctions on Italy. That did not work very well because, the lesson that people drew from that was economic sanctions don't work. Just look what happened in the League. I draw a different conclusion because when you look closely at it, the most important element then as now to be embargoed, or if you will, was oil. And that was, they never added oil to the list that of things not to be sent to Italy. Well, when you're in the middle of a war, what you really want is lots and lots of oil. This may sound a little familiar. All you have to do is pick up today's newspaper and you'll find out petroleum is still the single most important item on the embargo list. And of course, the world's biggest exporter of petroleum in 1936 was not a member of the League of Nations. That was the United States of America, who continued to export oil to Italy. So and Hitler, Mussolini is supposed to have said to Hitler later on after this, that if oil had been added to the embargo list, he would have had to end the war in 6 days. The other thing that could have been done that wasn't was the closing of the Suez Canal. Mussolini was able to ship his soldiers and his supplies and his armaments through the Suez Canal to attack and conduct his war in Ethiopia. Well, the Suez Canal was controlled by at that time by the United Kingdom. Anyway, then when the United Nations was set up, they also included a specific provision for economic sanctions. Now, let me go back a bit. The reason for putting in these economic sanctions, it was always tied to the horrors of war. World War I had been horrific. World War II was arguably worse, but that's a matter of how you look at these things. But they were both horrible wars. This was not the way warfare had been conducted hundreds of years before, where all the soldiers went off to a big field or some battlefield, fought it out away from the cities and towns. Well, World War II certainly was not like that. You want to know what World War II was like? Take a look at what's going on in Ukraine right now. That's what World War II was like. Cities being reduced to rubble. It was just horrific. So it was to say, we've got to avoid war. And so they came up with this idea, well, what about economic sanctions? Maybe we can prevent or deter war or end wars using an instrument that's not so horrible as war. Uh, people, there were some people speaking loosely who refer to economic sanctions as an instrument of war. That's quite misleading in terms of the history of economic sanctions. The whole point was not to use them as an instrument of war, it was to use them instead of going to war. War involves shooting, bombing, and whatnot. It's best to keep the language precise when you're talking about this. So they were developed as an alternative to war. They weren't used much by the United Nations. And the reason for that, I imagine you already would know if you know anything about the United Nations, is the United Nations had the veto. And during the Cold War, of course, the Soviet Union and China, had the veto, and the United States had the veto, and so not much got done in the way of by the Security Council. Now, two questions I'd like to just pose for people to think about. The question that always comes up when people, the press wants to interview me is, well, do economic sanctions work? It's a very annoying question from my standpoint, because what I want to do is come back and say, well, what do you mean by work? Does military force work? Military force causes buildings to fall down. Is military? How's that working out for Putin these days? He certainly hasn't accomplished his goals. He thought he would waltz in there in the first week, and everybody else thought this would happen too, and this war would be over in a week and a half. After all, you had Russia with all of this military force, and the poor Ukrainians are just grabbing people off the street and sticking a gun in their hands and saying, "Go fight." So if you look at it, the Russian effort so far is not very impressive evidence that military force, by work, I mean accomplishing your goals at an acceptable cost. People forget about that cost part of it. Economic sanctions do not knock down buildings. They do not cause people to drop dead in the street. So they're less impressive. But they certainly have Putin's attention. They are certainly making him rethink his goals. They are certainly making him wonder about the cost and seeing the cost of this war as being more a little higher than he likely expected it to be. Did I do something there to the, there you are. I didn't know if I did something. Um, so if you look at both the costs and the benefits and look at the ratio between costs and benefits, I would say economic sanctions usually work much better than military force. Um, and some studies have been done, quantitative studies that say, well, they only work about a third of the time, only achieve their goals about a third of the time. And isn't that a terrible thing? Why in the world would we choose to use policy instruments that only achieve their goals a third of the time? Well, American students would understand this. Why in the world would a baseball player who only gets a hit a third of the time even bother going to the plate? And why would professional teams pay them millions of dollars to for baseball players who only get a hit a third of the time? Well, Americans know that that's a pretty good batting average. Well, what's a good batting average in international politics for influence attempts by one state on another? We don't know. I don't know. You don't know. Nobody knows because that research has not really been done. The best research we have comparing military force with economic sanctions is they both work about somewhere between or succeed between about 30 and 40% of the time. But one thing we know for sure is military force is going to cost a lot more to use than economic sanctions. And this is why my last question, the question that should always be asked talking about economic sanctions is compared to what? Okay, if they only work a third of the time, compared to what? What works better? If you don't have a response to the what would work better at an acceptable cost, at a reasonable cost, then it seems to me they're working pretty well. And most of the time, I would say they work better or they work about as well or not much worse than military force, and they cost a hell of a lot less, almost always. Anyway, let me halt there and see what kind of questions you have.
Yeah, thank you. You answered a couple of my questions I had here already, some of which were related to kind of how effective are economic sanctions, especially compared to other forms of or to warfare as a separate thing. One question is, do you think the act of withdrawing from Russian banks has swift teeth? Is it something that takes effect quickly? And with the sanction depleted, how much left in the tank do you think the U.S. and its allies would have with that sanction?
After, did you mention SWIFT?
So yes, yeah.
You know what SWIFT is?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, I'm impressed by that. That refers to the financial system, the international banking system, and money flies around the world, huge sums every day. And so, yes, that definitely had an impact on the Russian banking system. And for a few days there, a lot of Russians were carrying MasterCards and Visa, and they found out they didn't work anymore. Now, they were able to compensate for that by setting up their own Russian system, cards, credit cards that for use within Russia. So this is not an insurmountable thing, but it's made doing business in Russia, and much more complex, and in a way that's brought home to the ordinary Russian too. They're at least aware of this, and in addition, so but when you ask how much more have we, I think what you were asking is, have we used everything we got? What else can we do? Well, the answer to that, of course, was is what I mentioned earlier. What the way Russia's able to keep this war going, to afford to keep this war going, is they earn a lot of dollars by selling gas and oil, especially to Western Europe. And these countries, especially Germany, but also other countries in Western Europe, are heavily dependent on Russian gas and oil. And if they use it for heating purposes, they use it for power generation, all kinds of things. And so that's the big sledgehammer that could be used. The problem is that's going to be it's not going to be as costly as war, in the sense that you don't have bodies in the street and you don't have buildings falling down, but you might have buildings that go unheated next winter. And if you happen to live in Poland, for example, that can get pretty cold. And people can even die from that. I'm not saying I'm not saying economic sanctions never kill anybody. They just kill a lot fewer people and cause a lot less. They're just a lot less costly than military force. So, but the question, we'll see what the Europeans are willing to do. It's easy for the Americans to sit back and say, well, we're not going to use any Russian gas or oil, but we have our own. It's very easy for us. It's not so easy if you're in Germany or Poland, Italy, some of these countries that are heavily dependent on Russian oil. And I think they are rethinking whether it was wise to let themselves become so dependent on Russian oil. Well, that you have another question.
Yeah, so I'm kind of going along with that in terms of the consequences down the road. So what are the kind of long-term economic implications, or some of them, of the sanctions placed on the Russian economy? And would there be spillovers, like potentially losing out on oil, to the rest of the world, that policymakers should be thinking about?
Like potentially what?
So like kind of related to what you were saying, with if there was an embargo on oil, and there'd be consequences associated with that, would there be other kind of spillover consequences?
Well, there certainly are. But Ukraine was a big exporter of food, especially to poor countries in Africa, for example. There are poor people in Africa right now going hungry. But why? It's because of the war. It's not because of the economic sanctions. We don't have economic sanctions on Ukraine. We have economic sanctions on Russia. It's the war that is causing people in Africa who can't get Ukrainian food to go hungry. I don't think there's anyone in Russia going hungry yet. And I don't think there will be. Russia, remember, is a big self-sufficient country. They're very much like the United States in that sense of being self-sufficient. They can grow enough food inside Russia to feed themselves. and they certainly have enough oil to heat. So they are going to be poorer. Their estimates are that their gross national product will be about 15% less next year or this year than it otherwise would have been. Now, if you took away the revenue from oil exports, it would be a lot more than that. Maybe 50% instead of 15%. But that's not going to happen right away. It's just too high a price for the Europeans to pay. Now, if this war drags on and he just digs in and occupies, after all, Russia has more military power than Ukraine. I guess they've got enough to destroy Ukraine. And if these economic sanctions are kept on, when you mean the long term, I don't know, say 5 years from now, it could really be disruptive to the Russian economy. And especially Europeans now, a lot of the Europeans are starting programs to wean themselves away from Russian dependence on Russian oil and gas. But that's going to be a 5 to 10 year process. And you can't do it tomorrow because you have to develop alternative sources of energy or sources of oil and gas. So that's remind me, what are the other part of your question?
That was pretty much it. The long-term economic implications of the sanctions and maybe spillovers into the rest of the world. You mentioned Europe, and that would probably be the main victim of any spillovers in that case. And
supply chains have been disrupted already, and you're going to get some of the inflation in the United States, some of the inflation elsewhere in the world will be attributable to this, although most of the world does not get other things from Russia. Russia exports one thing, that's oil and gas. It's not like they're a country that exports a lot of different things where you would say, oh, well, we're going to have to go without those Russian dolls that go inside one another. I think we could probably get along without those. It's the oil market where we're seeing the differences when we try to put gas in the car here, and you can see it right now, that I'm not saying it's entirely attributable to the sanctions, because we've got inflation in other areas as well. But certainly part of it, all of us are paying that when we fill up a car with gas, paying for the sanctions. So they're not costless. Remember, they're a lot cheaper than dropping bombs.
You mentioned renewable energy briefly. If there's any positive that we're looking for, do you see this as like kind of a push to really expedite introducing renewable energy, or not so much?
Oh, I think yes, it's going to have that. It's got the countries in Western Europe who've always been sympathetic toward the idea of alternative sources of energy. But this has been a kind of a kick in the rear end for them to say, oh, well, maybe we better speed things up here because there's this downside of being dependent on Russian oil. So that could be a good thing. Now, there is, I would like to address one other thing here that's terribly important, the elephant in the room with respect to the current situation in Ukraine and Russia. Russia's not just another country. Russia has nuclear weapons. Perhaps the biggest or one of the biggest, they certainly have one of the biggest storehouses of nuclear weapons, but I'm not really concerned about the big storehouse or the huge missiles that would destroy whole cities. I'm concerned about these. They have a lot of small, what they call tactical nuclear weapons that can be shot out of a cannon, say a 155 howitzer. I don't know if you know what that is, but that's the kind of howitzers were used in World War II. Very ordinary, quite common weapon, heavy weapon. And there are nuclear shells that could be put out of there. Now, everybody agrees we need to have limits on war. And the question is then, the thing about a limit on war, I mean, because now with the weapons we have, we can destroy life as we know it on this planet if we don't find put a limit on war. And the thing about limits on war is everybody, all the countries, have to agree on where to draw the line. And so it has to, how do you find a limit that everybody can agree on? Now, how did they find the limit, to divide Korea in half on the 38th parallel? Well, the 38th parallel had the advantage, it was on everybody's map, and it's in the same place on everybody's map. Communist maps, capitalist maps, 38th parallel is in the same place. So that was very helpful. And a limit on war also needs to be discrete, not continuous. If it's continuous, the problem then is, well, the explosive power, they use hundreds or thousands of pounds of TNT to measure explosive power of smaller nuclear weapons anyway. The one at Hiroshima, I think, was maybe 1,500 kilotons or something like that. And these, you could have small nuclear weapons. The problem with saying, oh, well, let's draw the line at small tactical nuclear weapons is there's no general agreement. What is a tactical nuclear weapon? Is 5 kilotons tactical? What about 6? What about 5.5? But the nice thing about the nuclear, non-nuclear is it's a clear line. Everybody knows what that difference is, or every nuclear physicist does, and every high school kid who studied physics knows when a nuclear weapon goes off. Whether it's a small one or a big one, it's a different kind of phenomenon. So it's a discrete place to draw the line. It's nothing fuzzy about it. And it's not a continuum where you could say, well, if 5 kilotons is okay, and maybe 5.25 or something, you can have this kind of escalation. But we've got to keep from crossing that nuclear threshold. And it only takes a little one. One little tactical nuclear weapon fired from a 155 howitzer will cross a line and destroy a limit that has been in place since 1945. And that tradition is worth keeping. And economic sanctions can help in the sense that they're an alternative to shooting. Now, could they get so severe that they would cause Putin to, could they make him so upset that he would use nuclear weapons? You run that risk. There's a gamble. Life is risky. But I think it's less risky with economic sanctions than if the United States were to send troops and so on and get involved militarily in Ukraine, which at least at this point, we do not seem inclined to do. And I think that's a good thing. It's terrible what's going on there, but it's also important not to let it escalate to the nuclear level.
Yeah, very, very important. Well, thank you so much for, and especially with that final kind of distinction and that umbrella, and for providing all the context of how economic sanctions are at play in all these different parts and with all over the world, as well. So this was wonderful, and thank you for your both your kind of spiel and the Q&A. Thank you for joining us today and for sharing your perspective on economic sanctions and on the war in Ukraine. So thank you, Professor Baldwin, very much for being here.
So my pleasure.